Hello again, pretty shiny peoples. Sorry about that. I, you know, let's just say renovations exposed some other problems that needed to be taken care of. So we had to have these other problems taken care of, which created another problem, which should have been a super easy problem to fix. Only it's been weeks of back and forth. They finally get here to fix it, and they do it wrong and try to insist that the reason they did it wrong was policy. So then I had to call the company and explain what happened to the company and ask them some questions. And now I have to wait for a new person to come tomorrow. Yay! So, super sorry about that interruption. That was not supposed to happen today. That's why I got started early. Apparently, I should not have. But here we are again, and we shall continue reading as if that did not happen. So, these last few weeks have been extra fun. I'm sorry, guys. Um, Everything will come together at some point. So they say. All right. Let's find where we were. Um, the old man turned to look at him, blinking in surprise and fear. "Leave me alone, boy," he said. He raised his walking stick and brandished it clumsily in Jake's direction. "Would you know if there's a place called Markery Academy any place around here, sir?" This was utter desperation, but it was the only thing he could think to ask. The old man slowly lowered his stick. It was the "sir" that had done it. He looked at Jake with the slightly lunatic interest of the old and almost senile. "How come you not in school, boy?" Jake smiled wearily. This one was getting very old. "Finals week. I came down here to look up an old friend of mine who goes to Markery Academy. That's all. Sorry to have bothered you." He stepped around the old man, hoping he wouldn't decide to whop him one across the ass with his cane just for good luck, and was almost down to the corner when the old man yelled, "Boy! Boy!" Jake turned around. "There is no Markery Academy down here," the old man said. "22 years I'm living here, so I should know. Markery Avenue, yes, but no Markery Academy." Jake's stomach cramped with sudden excitement. He took a step back toward the old man, who at once raised his cane into a defensive position again. Jake stopped at once, leaving a 20-foot safety zone between them. "Where's Markery Avenue, sir? Can you tell me that?" "Of course," the old man said. "Didn't I say I'm living here 22 years? 2 blocks down, turn left at the Majestic Theater. But I'm telling you now, there is no Markery Academy." "Thank you, sir. Thank you." Jake turned around and looked up Castle Avenue. Yes, he could see the unmistakable shape of a movie marquee jutting out over the sidewalk a couple of blocks up. He started to run toward it, then decided that might attract attention and slowed down to a fast walk. The old man watched him go. "Sir," he said to himself in a tone of mild amusement, "sir yet." He chuckled rustily and moved on. Roland's band stopped at dusk. The gunslinger dug a shallow pit and lit a fire. They didn't need it for cooking purposes, but they needed it nonetheless. Eddie needed it. If he was going to finish his carving, he would need light to work by. The gunslinger looked around and saw Susanna, a dark silhouette against the fading aquamarine sky, but he didn't see Eddie. "Where is he?" he asked. "Down the road a piece. You leave him alone now, Roland. You've done enough." Roland nodded, bent over the fire pit, and struck at a piece of flint with the worn steel bar. Soon the kindling he had gathered was blazing. He added small sticks, one by one, and waited for Eddie to return. Half a mile back the way they had come, Eddie sat cross-legged in the middle of the great road with his unfinished key in one hand, watching the sky. He glanced down the road, saw the spark of fire, and knew exactly what Roland was doing, and why. Then he turned his gaze to the sky again. He had never felt so lonely, or so afraid. The sky was huge. He could not remember ever seeing so much uninterrupted space, so much pure emptiness. It made him feel very small, and he supposed there was nothing at all wrong with that. In the scheme of things, he was very small. The boy was close now. He thought he knew where Jake was and what he was about to do, and it filled him with silent wonder. Susanna had come from 1963. Eddie had come from 1987, but between them, Jake, trying to come over, trying to be born. I met him, Eddie thought. I must have met him, and I think I remember. Sort of. It was just before Henry went into the army, right? He was taking courses at Brooklyn Vocational Institute, and he was heavily into black jeans, black motorcycle boots with steel caps, black t-shirts with sleeves rolled up, Henry James Dean look. Smoking era chic. I used to think that, but I never said it out loud because I didn't want him pissed at me. He realized that what he had been waiting for had happened while he was thinking. Old Star had come out. In 15 minutes, maybe less, it would be joined by a whole galaxy of alien jewelry, but for now it gleamed alone in the ungathered darkness. Eddie slowly held up the key until Old Star gleamed with its wide central notch, and then he recited the old formula of his world, the one his mother had taught him as she knelt beside him in the bedroom window, both of them looking out at the evening star which rode the oncoming darkness above the rooftops and firescapes of Brooklyn. Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. Wish I may, wish I might, have this wish I wish tonight. Old Star glowed in the notch of a key, a diamond caught in ash. Help me find some guts, Eddie said. That's my wish. Help me find the guts to try and finish this damned thing. He sat there a moment longer, then got to his feet and walked slowly back to camp. He sat down as close to the fire as he could get, took the gunslinger's knife without a word to either him or Susanna, and began to work. Tiny curling slivers of wood rolled up from the S shape at the end of the key. Eddie worked fast, turning the key this way and that, occasionally closing his eyes and letting his thumb slip along the mild curves. He tried not to think about what might happen if the shape were to go wrong. That would freeze him for sure. Roland and Susanna sat behind him, watching silently. At last, Eddie put the knife aside. His face was running with sweat. This kid of yours, he said. This Jake. He must be a gutty brat. He was brave under the mountains, Roland said. He was afraid, but he never gave an inch. I wish I could be that way. Roland shrugged. At Balazar's you fought well, even though they had taken your clothes. It's very hard for a man to fight naked, but you did it. Eddie tried to remember the shootout in the nightclub, but it was just a blur in his mind. Smoke, noise, and a light shining through one wall in confused, intersecting rays. He thought that wall had been torn apart by automatic weapons fire, but couldn't remember for sure. He held the key up so its notches were sharply outlined against the flames. He held it that way for a long time, looking mostly at the S shape. It looked exactly as he had remembered it from his dream and from the momentary vision he had seen in the fire, but it didn't feel exactly right. Almost, but not quite. That's just Henry again. That's just all those years of never being quite good enough. You did it, buddy. It's just that Henry inside doesn't want to admit it. He dropped the key onto the square of hide and folded the edges carefully around it. I'm done. I don't know if it's right or not, but I guess it's as right as I can make it. He felt oddly empty now, and he no longer had the key to work on, purposeless and directionless. Do you want something to eat, Eddie? Susanna asked quietly. There's your purpose, he thought. There's your direction, sitting right over there with her hands folded in her lap. All the purpose and direction you'll ever... But now something else rose in his mind. It came all at once. Not a dream, not a vision. No, neither of those. It's a memory. It's happening again. You're remembering forward in time. I have to do something else first, he said, and got up. On the far side of the fire, Roland had stacked some odd lots of scavenged wood. Eddie hunted through them and found a dry stick about 2 feet long and 4 inches or so through the middle. He took it and, returning to his place by the fire, and picked up Roland's knife again. This time he worked faster, because he was simply sharpening the stick, turning it into something that looked like a small tent peg. "Can we get moving before daybreak?" he asked the gunslinger. "I think we should get to that circle as soon as we can." "Yes, sooner if we must. I don't want to move in the dark. The speaking ring is an unsafe place to be at night, but if we have to, we have to." "From the look on your face, big boy, I doubt if those stone circles are very safe at any time," Susanna said. Eddie put the knife aside again. The dirt Roland had taken out of the shallow hole he'd made for the campfire was piled up by Eddie's right foot. Now he used the sharp end of the stick to carve a question mark shape in the dirt. The shape was crisp and clear. "Okay," he said, brushing it away. "All done." "Have something to eat, then," Susanna said. Eddie tried, but he wasn't very hungry. When he finally went to sleep, nestled against Susanna's warmth, his rest was dreamless but very thin. Until the gunslinger shook him awake at 4 in the morning, he heard the wind racing endlessly over the plain below them, and it seemed to him that he went with it, flying high into the night, away from these cares, while Old Star and Old Mother rode serenely above him, painting his cheeks with frost. "It's time," Roland said. Eddie sat up beside him, rubbing her palms over her face. As Eddie's head cleared, his mind was filled with urgency. "Yes, let's go, and fast. He's getting close, isn't he?" "Very close." Eddie got to his feet, grasped Susanna around the waist, and boosted her into her chair. She looked at him anxiously. "Do we still have enough time to get there?" Eddie nodded. "Barely." 3 minutes later they were headed down the great road again. It glimmered ahead of them like a ghost, and a half-hour after that, as the first light of dawn began to touch the sky in the east, a rhythmic sound began far ahead of them. The sound of drums, Roland thought. Machinery, Eddie thought. Some huge piece of machinery. "It's a heart," Susanna thought. "Some huge deceased beating heart, and it's in that city where we have to go." 2 hours later the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. White, featureless clouds had begun to fill the sky above them, first veiling the early sun, then blotting it out. The circle of standing stones lay less than 5 miles ahead now, gleaming in the shadowless light like the teeth of a fallen monster. Spaghetti Week at the Majestic. The battered, dispirited marquee jutting over the corner. One moment. I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know why this keeps happening. All right. They were calling me about the person coming out tomorrow. Again, so sorry. Where were we? Spaghetti Week at the Majestic, the battered, dispirited marquee jutting over the corner of Brooklyn and Marquee Avenues proclaimed. 2 Sergio Leone classics, A Fistful of Dollars, plus Good, Bad, and Ugly, 99 cents, all shows. A gum-chewing cutie with rollers in her blonde hair sat in the box office listening to Led Zepp on her transistor and reading one of the tabloids of which Mrs. Shaw was so fond. To her left, in the theater's remaining display case, there was a poster showing Clint Eastwood. Jake knew he should get moving. 3 o'clock was almost here, but he paused a moment anyway, staring at the poster behind the dirty, cracked glass. Eastwood was wearing a Mexican stripe. A cigar was clamped in his teeth. He had thrown one side of the stripe over his shoulder to free his gun. His eyes were a pale, faded blue, bombardier's eyes. It's not him, Jake thought. But it's almost him. It's the eyes, mostly. The eyes are almost the same. You let me drop, he said to the man in the old poster, the man who was not Roland. You let me die. What happens this time? Hey, kid, the blonde ticket seller called, making Jake start. You gonna come in or just stand there and talk to yourself? Not me, Jake said. I've already seen those 2. He got moving again, turning left on Marquee Avenue. Once again, he waited for the feeling of remembering forward to seize him, but it didn't come. This was just a hot, sunny street lined with sandstone-colored apartment buildings that looked like prison cell blocks to Jake. A few young women were walking along, pushing baby carriages in pairs and talking desultorily, but the street was otherwise deserted. It was unseasonably hot for me, too hot to stroll. What am I looking for? What? From behind him came a burst of raucous male laughter. It was followed by an outrageous female shriek. You give that back! Jake jumped, thinking the owner of the voice must mean him. Give it back, Henry. I'm not kidding. Jake turned and saw 2 boys, one at least 18 and the other a lot younger, 12 or 13. At the sight of the second boy, Jake's heart did something that felt like a loop-the-loop in his chest. The kid was wearing green corduroys instead of Madras short, but the yellow t-shirt was the same, and he had a battered old basketball under one arm. Although his back was to Jake, Jake knew he had found the boy from last night's dream. The girl was the gum-chewing cutie from the ticket booth. The older of the 2 boys, who looked almost old enough to be called a man, had her newspaper in his hands. She grabbed for it. The newspaper grabber, he was wearing denims and a black t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up, held it over his head, and grinned. Jump for it, Marianne. Jump, girl, jump. She stared at him with angry eyes, her cheeks flushed. Give it to me, she said. Quit fooling around and give it back, bastard. Ooh, listen to that, Eddie, the older kid said. Bad language. Naughty, naughty. He waved the newspaper just out of the blonde ticket seller's grasp, grinning, and Jake suddenly understood. These 2 were walking home from school together, although they probably didn't go to the same one if he was right about the difference in their ages. And the bigger boy had gone over to the box office pretending he had something interesting to tell the blonde. Then he had reached through the slot at the bottom and snatched her paper. The big boy's face was one that Jake had seen before. It was the face of a kid who would think it the height of hilarity to douse a cat's tail with lighter fluid or feed a bread ball with a fish hook planted in the middle to a hungry dog. The sort of kid who sat in the back of the room and snapped bra straps and then said, Who, me? With a big dumb look of surprise on his face when someone finally complained. There weren't many kids like him at Piper, but there were a few. Jake supposed there were a few in every school. They dressed better at Piper, but the face was the same. He guessed that in the old days, people would have said it was the face of a boy who was born to be hung. Marianne jumped for her newspaper, which the old boy in the black pants had rolled into a tube. He pulled it out of her reach just before she could grab it, then whacked her on the head with it, the way you might whack a dog for piddling on the carpet. She was beginning to cry now, mostly from humiliation, Jake guessed. Her face was now so red it was almost glowing. "Keep it, then," she yelled at him. "I know you can't read, but you can look at pictures at least." She began to turn away. "Give it back, why don't you?" the younger boy, Jake's boy, said softly. The old boy held out the newspaper tube. The girl snatched it from him, and even from his place 30 feet down the street Jake heard it rip. "You're a turd, Henry Dean," she cried. "A real turd." "Hey, what's the big deal?" Henry sounded genuinely injured. "It was just a joke. Besides, it's only ripped in one place. You can still read it, for Christ's sake. Lighten up a little, why don't you?" And that was right, too, Jake thought. Guys like this Henry always pushed even the most unfunny jokes 2 steps too far, then looked wounded and misunderstood when someone yelled at them, and it was always, "What's the matter?" And it was, "Can't you take a joke?" And it was, "Why don't you lighten up a little?" "What are you doing with him, kid?" Jake wondered. "If you're on my side, what are you doing with a jerk like that?" But as the younger kid turned around and they started to walk down the street again, Jake knew. The old boy's features were heavier and his complexion was badly pitted with acne, but otherwise the resemblance was striking. The 2 boys were brothers. Jake turned away and began to idle up the sidewalk ahead of the 2 boys. He reached into his breast pocket with a shaky hand, pulled out his father's sunglasses, and managed to fumble them onto his face. Voices swelled behind him as if someone was gradually turning up the volume on a radio. "You shouldn't have ranked on her that bad, Henry. It was mean. She loves it, Eddie." Henry's voice was complacent, worldly wise. "When you get a little older, you'll understand." "She was crying." "Probably got on the rag," Henry said in a philosophical tone. They were very close now. Jake shrank against the side of the building. His head was down, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jeans. He didn't know why it seemed so vitally important that he not be noticed, but it did. Henry didn't matter one way or the other, but the younger one isn't supposed to remember me, he thought. I don't know why exactly, but he's not. They passed him without so much as a glance. The one Henry had called Eddie walking on the outside, dribbling the basketball along the gutter. "You gotta admit she looked funny," Henry was saying. "Old Bebop Mary Ann jumping for the newspaper. Woof, woof." Eddie looked at his brother with an expression that wanted to be reproachful, and then gave up and dissolved into laughter. Jake saw the unconditional love in that upturned face and guessed that Eddie would forgive a lot in his big brother before giving it up as a bad job. "So are we going?" Eddie asked now. "You said we could, after school." "I said maybe. I don't know if I want to walk all the way over there. Mom will be home by now, too. Maybe we just ought to forget about it, go upstairs and watch some tube." They were 10 feet ahead of Jake and pulling away. "Aw, come on. You said." Beyond the building the 2 boys were currently passing was a chain-link fence with an open gate in it. Beyond it, Jake saw, was a playground of which he had dreamed last night. A version of it, anyway. It was surrounded by trees, and there was no odd subway kiosk with diagonal slashes of yellow and black across the front, but the cracked concrete was the same. So were the faded yellow foul lines. Well, maybe. I don't know. Jake realized Henry was teasing again. Eddie didn't, though. He was too anxious, but whatever it was about wherever it was he wanted to go. Let's shoot some hoops while I think it over." He stole the ball from his younger brother, dribbled clumsily along the playground, and went for a layup that hit high on the backboard and bounced back without even touching the rim of the hoop. Henry was good at stealing newspapers from teenage girls, Jake thought, but on the basketball court he sucked the big one. Eddie walked in through the gate, unbuttoned his corduroy pants, and slipped them down. Beneath them were the faded Madras shorts he had been wearing in Jake's dream. "Oh, he is wearing his shorty panties," Henry said. "Ain't they cute?" He waited until his brother balanced himself on one leg to pull off his cords, then flung the basketball at him. Eddie managed to bat it away, probably saving himself a bloody nose, but he had lost his balance and fell clumsily to the concrete. He didn't cut himself, but he could have done so, Jake saw. A great deal of broken glass glittered in the sun along the chain link. "Come on, Henry, quit it," he said, but with no real approach. Jake guessed Henry had been pulling shit like this on him for so long that Eddie only noticed it when Henry pulled it on someone else, someone like the blonde ticket seller. Come on, Henry, quit it. Eddie got to his feet and trotted out onto the court. The ball had struck the chain-link fence and bounced back to Henry. Henry now tried to dribble past his younger brother. Eddie's hand went out, lightning quick but oddly delicate, and stole the ball. He easily ducked under Henry's outstretched, flailing arm and then went for the basket. Henry dogged him, frowning thunderously, but he might as well have been taking a nap. Eddie went up, knees bent, feet neatly cocked, and laid the ball in. Henry grabbed it and dribbled out to the stripe. Shouldn't have done that, Eddie, Jake thought. He was standing just beyond the place where the fence ended, watching the two boys. This seemed safe enough, at least for the moment. He was wearing his dad's sunglasses, and the two boys were so involved in what they were doing, they wouldn't have noticed if President Carter had strolled up to watch. Jake doubted if Henry knew who President Carter was anyway. He expected Henry to foul his brother, perhaps heavily as payback for the steal, but he had underestimated Henry's guile. Henry offered a head fake that wouldn't have fooled Jake's mother, but Eddie appeared to fall for it. Henry broke past him and drove the basket, gaily traveling the ball most of the way. Jake was quite sure Eddie could have caught him easily and stolen the ball again, but instead of doing so, the kid hung back. Henry laid it up clumsily, and the ball bounced back off the rim again. Eddie grabbed it and then let it squirt through his fingers. Henry snatched it, turned, and put it through the netless hoop. "One up," Henry panted. "Play to 12? "Sure." Jake had seen enough. It would be close, but in the end, Henry would win. Eddie would see to it. It would do more than save him from getting lumped up. It would put Henry in a good mood, making him more agreeable to whatever it was Eddie wanted to do. "Hey, Moose, I think your little brother has been playing you like a violin for a long time now, and you don't have the slightest idea, do you?" He drew back until the apartment building, which stood at the north end of the court, cut off his view of the Dean brothers, and their view of him. He leaned against the wall and listened to the thump of the ball on the court. Soon Henry was puffing like Charlie the Choo-Choo going up a steep hill. He would be a smoker, of course. Guys like Henry were always smokers. The game took almost 10 minutes, and by the time Henry claimed victory, the street was filled up with other homegoing kids. A few gave Jake curious glances as they passed by. "Good game, Henry," Eddie said. "Not bad," Henry panted. "You're still falling for the same old head fake." "Sure he is," Jake thought. "I think he'll go on falling for it until he's gained about 80 pounds. Then you might get a surprise." "I guess I am. Hey, Henry, can't we please go look at the place?" "Yeah, why not? Let's do it." "All right," Eddie yelled. There was the smacking sound of flesh on flesh, probably Eddie giving his brother a high five. "Boss, you go on up to the apartment. Tell Mom we'll be in by 4:30, 4:45. But don't say anything about the mansion. She'd have a shit fit. She thinks it's haunted, too." You want me to tell her we're going over to Dewey's?" Silence as Henry considered this. "Nah, she might call Mrs. Bunkowski. Tell her we're going down to the Dollies to get Hoodsy rockets. She'll believe that. Ask her for a couple of bucks, too." "She won't give me any money. Not 2 days before payday." "Bullshit. You can get it out of her. Go on now." "Okay." But Jake didn't hear Eddie moving. "Henry?" "What?" impatiently. "Is the mansion haunted, do you think?" Jake sidled a little closer to the playground. He didn't want to be noticed, but he strongly felt that he needed to hear this. "Nah, there ain't no real haunted houses. Just in those fucking movies." "Oh." There was unmistakable relief in Eddie's voice. "But if there ever was one," Henry resumed. Perhaps he didn't want his little brother feeling too relieved, Jake thought. "It'd be the mansion. I heard that a couple of years ago 2 kids from Norwood Street went in there to bump uglies and the cops found them with their throats cut and all the blood drained out of their bodies. But there wasn't any blood on 'em or around 'em. Get it? The blood was all gone." "You shitting me?" Eddie breathed. "Nope. But that wasn't the worst thing." "What was?" "Their hair was dead white," Henry said. The voice that drifted to Jake was solemn. He had an idea that Henry wasn't teasing this time, that this time he believed every word he was saying. He also doubted that Henry had brains enough to make such a story up. Both of them? And their eyes were wide and staring like they saw the most gross, awful thing in the world. Ah, give me a break, Eddie said, but his voice was soft and odd. You still want to go? Sure, as long as we don't, have to get too close. Then go see Mom, and try to get a couple of bucks out of her. I need cigarettes. Take the fucking ball up, too. Jake drifted backward and stepped into the nearest apartment building entryway just as Eddie came out through the playground gate. To his horror, the boy in the yellow t-shirt turned in Jake's direction. Holy cow, he thought, dismayed. What if this is his building? It was. Jake just had time to turn around and begin to scan the names beside the rank of buzzers before Eddie Dean brushed past him, so close that Jake could smell the sweat he had worked up on the basketball court. He half sensed, half saw the curious glance the boy tossed in his direction. Then Eddie was in the lobby and headed for the elevators with his school pants bundled under one arm and the scuffed basketball under the other. Jake's heart was thudding heavily in his chest. Shadowing people was a lot harder in real life than it was in the detective novels he sometimes read. He crossed the street and stood between two apartment buildings half a block up. From here he could see both the entrance to the Dean Brothers building and the playground. The playground was filling up now, mostly with little kids. Henry leaned against the chain link, smoking a cigarette and trying to look full of teenage angst. Every now and then, he would stick out a foot as one of the little kids bolted toward him at an all-out run, and before Eddie returned, he had succeeded in tripping 3 of them. The last of these went sprawling full length, smacking his face on the concrete, and ran wailing up the street with a bloody forehead. Henry flicked his cigarette butt after him and laughed cheerfully. Just an all-around fun guy, Jake thought. After that, the little kid wizened up and began giving him a wide berth. Henry strolled out of the playground and down the street to the apartment building. Eddie had entered 5 minutes before. As he reached it, the door opened and Eddie came out. He had changed into a pair of jeans and a fresh t-shirt. He also had tied a green bandana, the same one he had been wearing in Jake's dream, around his forehead. He was waving a couple of dollar bills triumphantly. Henry snatched them, then asked Eddie something. Eddie nodded, and the 2 boys set off. Keeping half a block between himself and them, Jake followed. They stood in the high grass at the edge of the great road looking at the speaking ring. Stonehenge, Susanna thought, and shuddered. That's what it looks like, Stonehenge. Although the thick grass was covered the plain grew around the bases of tall, gray monoliths, and the circles they enclosed were bare earth, littered here and there with white things. What are those? She asked in a low voice. Chips of stone? Look again, Roland said. She did and saw they were bones. The bones of small animals, maybe. She hoped. Eddie switched the sharpened stick to his left hand, dried the palm of his right against his shirt, and then switched it back again. He opened his mouth, but no sound came from his dry throat. He cleared it and tried again. I think I'm supposed to go in and draw something in the dirt. Roland nodded. Now? Soon. He looked into Roland's face. There's something here, isn't there? Something we can't see. It's not here right now, Roland said. At least I don't think it is. But it will come. Our Kef, our life force will draw it, and of course it will be jealous of its place. Give me my gun back, Eddie. Eddie unbuckled the belt and handed it over. Then he turned back to the circle of 20-foot-high stones. Something lived in there, all right. He could smell it. A stench that made him think of damp plaster and molding sofas and ancient mattresses rotting beneath half-liquid coats of mildew. It was familiar, that smell. The mansion. I smelled it there. The day I talked Henry into taking me over to see the mansion on Reinhold Street in Dutch Hill. Roland unbuckled his gun belt, then... What are you doing? Sorry, I got distracted. Roland buckled his gun belt, then bent to knot the tie down. He looked up at Susanna as he did. We may need Detta Walker, he said. Is she around? That bitch always around. Susanna wrinkled her nose. Good. One of us is going to have to protect Eddie while he does what he's supposed to do. The other is going to be so much useless baggage. This is a demon's place. Demons are not human, but they are male and female just the same. Sex is both their weapon and their weakness. No matter what the sex of the demon may be, it will go for Eddie to protect its place, to keep its place from being used by an outsider. Do you understand? Okay. Susanna nodded. Eddie appeared to not be listening. He had tucked the square of hide containing the key into his shirt, and now he was staring into the speaking ring as if hypnotized. There was no time to say this in a gentle or refined way, Roland told her. One of us is going to have to fuck it to keep it off Eddie, Susanna interrupted. This the sort of thing can't ever turn down a free fuck. That's what you're getting at, isn't it? Roland nodded. 1 second. There's a delivery truck across the street, in case you're wondering why she's not happy. Okay. Her eyes gleamed. They were the eyes of Detta Walker now, both wise and unkind, shining with hard amusement, and her voice slid steadily deeper into the bogus southern plantation drawl, which was Detta's trademark. If it's a girl demon, you get it. But if it's a boy demon, it's mine. That about right? Roland nodded. What about if it swings both ways? What about that, big boy? Roland's lips twitched in the barest suggestion of a smile. Then we'll take it together. Just remember. Beside them, in a fainting, distant voice, Eddie murmured, Not all is silent in the halls of the dead. Behold, the sleeper wakes. He turned his haunted, terrified eyes on Roland. There's a monster. The demon. No. A monster. Something between the doors, between the worlds. Something that waits. And it's opening its eyes. Susanna cast a frightened glance at Roland. Stand, Eddie, Roland said. Be true. Eddie drew a deep breath. I'll stand until it knocks me down, he said. I have to go in now. It's starting to happen. We're all going in, Susanna said. She arched her back and slipped out of her wheelchair. Any demon want to fuck with me, he gonna find out he's fucking with the finest. I throw him a fuck he ain't never gonna forget. As they passed between two of the tall stones and into the speaking circle, it began to rain. As soon as Jake saw the place, he understood two things. First, that he had seen it before, in his dreams, so terrible his conscious mind would not let him remember them. Second, that it was a place of death and murder and madness. He was standing on the far corner of Reinhold Street and Brooklyn Avenue, 70 yards from Henry and Eddie Dean, but even from where he was, he could feel the mansion ignoring them and reaching out for him with its eager, invisible hands. He thought there were talons at the end of those hands, sharp ones. It wants me, and I can't run away. It's death to go in, but it's madness not to, because somewhere inside that place is a locked door. I have the key that will open it, and the only salvation I can hope for is on the other side. He stared at the mansion, a house that almost screamed abnormality with a sinking heart. It stood in the center of its weedy, rioting yard like a tumor. The Dean brothers had walked across 9 blocks of Brooklyn, moving slowly under the hot afternoon sun, and had finally entered a section of town which had to be Dutch Hill, given the names on the shops and stores. Now they stood halfway down the block in front of the mansion. It looked as if it had been deserted for years, yet it had suffered remarkably little vandalism. And once, Jake thought, it really had been a mansion. The home, perhaps, of a wealthy merchant and his large family in those long-gone days. It must have been white. But now it was dirty gray. No color. The windows had been knocked out, and the peeling picket fence which surrounded it had been spray-painted, but the house itself was still intact. It slumped in the hot light, a ramshackle slated roof, revenant growing out of the hummocky trash-littered yard, somehow making Jake think of a dangerous dog which pretended to be asleep. Its steep roof overhung the front porch like a beetling brow. The boards of the porch were splintery and warped. Shutters, which might once have been green, leaned askew beside the glassless windows. Ancient curtains still hung in some of these, dangling like strips of dead skin. To the left, an elderly trellis leaned away from the building, now held up not by nails but only by the nameless and somehow filthy clusters of vines which crawled over it. There was a sign on the lawn and another on the door. From where Jake stood, he could read neither of them. The house was alive. He knew this, could feel its awareness reaching out for him. And the boards and the slumping roof could feel it pouring in rivers from the black sockets of its windows. The idea of approaching that terrible place filled him with dismay. The idea of actually going inside filled him with inarticulate horror, yet he would have to do so. He could hear a low, slumberous buzzing in his ears, the sound of a beehive on a hot summer day, and for a moment he was afraid he might faint. He closed his eyes, and his voice filled his head. "You must come, Jake. This is the path of the beam, the way of the tower, and the time of your drawing. Be true. Stand. Come to me." The fear didn't pass, but that terrible sense of impending panic did. He opened his eyes again and saw that he was not the only one who had sensed the power and awakening sentience of the place. Eddie was trying to pull away from the fence. He turned toward Jake, who could see Eddie's eyes wide and uneasy beneath his green headband. His big brother grabbed him and pushed him toward the rusty gate, but the gesture was too half-hearted to be much of a tease. However thick-headed he might be, Henry liked the mansion no better than Eddie did. They drew away a little and stood looking at the place for a while. Jake could not make out what they were saying to each other, but the tone of their voices was awed and uneasy. Jake suddenly remembered Eddie speaking in his dream. "Remember, there's danger, though. Be careful and be quick." Suddenly the real Eddie, the one across the street, raised his voice enough so that Jake could make out the words. "Can we go home now, Henry? Please? I don't like it." His tone was pleading. "Fucking little sissy," Henry said. But Jake thought he heard relief as well as indulgence in Henry's voice. "Come on." They turned away from the ruined house, crouching, high-shouldered behind its sagging fence, and approached the street. Jake backed up, then turned around and looked into the window of the dispirited little hole in the wall shop called Dutch Hill Used Appliances. He watched Henry and Dean, dim and ghostly reflections superimposed on an ancient Hoover vacuum cleaner, cross Reinhold Street. "Are you sure it's not really haunted?" Eddie asked as they stepped onto the sidewalk on Jake's side. "Well, I tell you what," Henry said. "Now that I've been out here again, I'm really not so sure." They passed directly behind Jake without looking at him. "Would you go in there?" Eddie asked. "Not for $1,000,000, Henry replied promptly. They rounded the corner. Jake stepped away from the window and peeped after them. They were headed back the way they had come, close together on the sidewalk. Henry hulking along in his steel-toed shit-kickers and his shoulders already slumped like those of a much older man. Eddie walking beside him with a neat, unconscious grace. Their shadows, long and trailing out into the street now, mingled amicably together. They were going home, Jake thought, and felt a wave of loneliness so strong that he felt it would crush him. Going to eat supper and do homework and argue over which TV shows to watch and then go to bed. Henry may be bullying shit, but they've got a life, those two. One that makes sense. And they're going back to it. I wonder if they have any idea how lucky they are. Eddie might, I suppose. Jake turned, adjusted the straps of his backpack, and crossed Reinhold Street. Susanna sensed movement in the empty grassland beyond the circle of standing stones. a sighing, whispering rush. Something's coming, she said tautly. Coming fast. Be careful, Eddie said, but keep it off of me. You understand? Keep it off of me. I hear you, Eddie. You just do your own thing. Eddie nodded. He knelt in the center of the ring, holding the sharpened stick out in front of him as if assessing its point. Then he lowered it and drew a dark, straight line in the dirt. Roland watched out for her. I will if I can, Eddie. But keep it off me. Jake's comin'. Crazy little mother's really comin'. Susanna could now see the grasses due north, the speaking ring parting in a long, dark line, creating a furrow that laced straight at the circle of stones. Get ready, Roland said. It'll go for Eddie. One of us will have to ambush it. Susanna reared up on her haunches like a snake coming out of a Hindu fakir's basket. Her hands rolled into hard, brown fists were held at the sides of her face. Her eyes blazed. I'm ready, she said, and then shouted, Come on, big boy. You come right on at me. Run like it's your birthday. The rain came to fall harder as the demon, which lived here, re-entered its circle in a booming rush. Susanna had just time to sense thick and merciless masculinity. It came to her as an eye-watering smell of gin and juniper, and then it shot toward the center of the circle. She closed her eyes and reached for it, not with her arms or her mind, but with all the female force which lived at the core of her. Hey, big ol' boy, where you going? The pussy be over here. It whirled. She felt its surprise, and then its raw hunger, as full and urgent as pulsing artery. It leaped upon her like a rapist springing from the mouth of an alley. Susanna howled and rocked backwards, cords stranding out on her neck. The dress she wore first flattened against her breast and belly, and then began to tear itself to shreds. She could hear a pointless, directionless panting, as if the air itself had decided to rut with her. Suze! Eddie shouted and began to get to his feet. No! She screamed back. Do it! I got this sumbitch right where I want him. Go on, Eddie. Bring the kid. Bring... Coldness battered at the tender flesh between her legs. She grunted, fell backward, then supported herself with one hand and thrust defiantly forward and upward. Bring him through! Eddie looked uncertain at Roland, who nodded. Eddie glanced at Susanna again, his eyes full of dark pain and darker fear, and then deliberately turned his back on both of them and fell to his knees again. He reached forward with the sharpened stick, which had become a makeshift pencil, ignoring the cold rain falling on his arms and back of his neck. The stick began to move, making the lines and angles, creating a shape Roland knew at once. It was a door. Jake reached out, put his hands on the splintery gate, and pushed. It swung slowly open on screaming, rust-clotted hinges. Ahead of him was an uneven brick path. Beyond the path was the porch. Beyond the porch was the door. It had been boarded shut. He walked slowly toward the house, heart telegraphing fast dots and dashes in his throat. Weeds had grown up between the buckled bricks. He could hear them rustling against his blue jeans. All his senses seemed to have been turned up 2 notches. You're not really going in there, are you? A panic-stricken voice in his head asked. And the answer that occurred to him seemed both totally nuts and perfectly reasonable. All things serve the beam. The sign on the lawn read, Absolutely no trespassing under penalty of law. The yellowing, rust-stained square of paper nailed to one of the boards crisscrossing the front door was more succinct. By order of NYC Housing Authority, this property condemned. Jake paused at the foot of the steps, looking up at the door. He had heard voices in the vacant lot, and now he could hear them again, but this was a choir of the damned, a babble of insane threats and equally insane promises, yet he thought it was all one voice, the voice of the house. The voice of some monstrous doorkeeper roused from its long, unpeaceful sleep. He thought briefly of his father's Ruger, even considered pulling it out of his pack, but what good would it do? Behind him, traffic passed back and forth on Reinhold Street, and a woman was yelling for her daughter to stop holding hands with that boy and bring in the wash. But he was in another world, one ruled by some bleak being over whom guns could have no power. Be true, Jake. Stand. Okay, he said in a low, shaky voice. Okay, I'll try. But you better not drop me again. Slowly, he began to mount the porch steps. The boards which barred the door were old and rotten, the nails rusty. Jake grabbed hold of the top set at the point where they crossed each other and yanked. They came free with a small squall that was the gate all over again. He tossed them over the porch rail and into the ancient flower bed where the old witch grass and dogweed grew. He bent, grasped the lower crossing, and paused for a moment. A hollow sound came through the door, the sound of some animal slobbering hungrily from deep inside a concrete pipe. Jake felt a sick sheen of sweat begin to break out on his cheeks and forehead. He was so frightened that he no longer felt precisely real. He seemed to have become a character in someone else's bad dream. The evil choir, the evil presence was behind this door. The sound of it seeped out like syrup. He yanked at the lower boards, and they came free easily. Of course it wants me to come in. It's hungry, and I'm supposed to be the main course. The snatch of poetry occurred to him suddenly, something Miss Avery had read to them. It was supposed to be about the plight of modern man who was cut off from all his roots and traditions, but to Jake it suddenly seemed that the man who had written that poem must have seen this house. I will show you something different from either, your shadow in the morning striding behind you, or your shadow in the evening rising to meet you. I'll show you fear in a handful of dust, Jake muttered, and put his hands on the doorknob. And as he did, the clear sense of relief and surety flooded him again, and the feeling that this was it. This time the door would open on the other world. He would see a sky untouched by smog and industrial smoke, and on the far horizon, not the mountains, but the hazy blue spires of some gorgeous, unknown city. He closed his fingers around the silver key in his pocket, hoping the door was locked so he could use it. It wasn't. The hinges screamed, and flakes of rust sifted down from their slowly revolving cylinders as the door opened. The smell of decay struck Jake like a physical blow. Wet wood, spongy plaster, rotting laths, ancient stuffing. Below the smells was another, the smell of some beast's lair. Ahead was a dank, shadowy hallway. To the left, a staircase pitched and yawed its crazy way into the upper shadows. Its collapsed banister lay splintered on the hallway floor, but Jake was not foolish enough to think it was just splinters he was looking at. There was bones in that litter as well, the bones of small animals. Some did not precisely look like animal bones, and these Jake would not look at over long. He knew he would never summon the courage to go further if he did. He paused on the threshold, screwing himself up to take the first step. He heard a faint muffled sound, very hard and very rapid, and realized it was his own teeth chattering in his head. Why doesn't someone stop me? He thought wildly. Why doesn't someone passing by on the sidewalk shout out, "Hey you, you're not supposed to be in there. Can't you read?" But he knew why. Pedestrians stuck mostly to the other side of the street, and those who came near this house did not linger. Even if someone did happen to look, they wouldn't see me, because I'm not really here. For better or worse, I've already left my world behind. I've started to cross over. His world is somewhere ahead. This was the hell between. Jake stepped into the corridor, and although he screamed when the door swung shut behind him with the sound of a mausoleum door being slammed, he wasn't surprised. Down deep, he wasn't surprised at all. Once upon a time, there had been a young woman named Etta Walker, who liked to frequent the honky-tonks and roadhouses along Ridgeline Road outside of Nutley, and on Route 88 down by the power lines outside of Amhi. She had legs in those days, and, as the song says, she knew how to use them. She would wear some tight, cheap dress that looked like silk but wasn't, and dance with the white boys while the band played all those au-fait party tunes like Double Shot of My Baby's Love and the Hippie Hippie Shake. Eventually, she would cut one of those honkies out of the pack and let him lead her back to his car in the parking lot. There, she would make out with him. One of the world's great soul kissers was Etta Walker, and no slouch with the old fingernails either, until he was just about insane, and then she'd shut him down. What happened next? Well, that was the question, wasn't it? That was the game. Some of them wept and begged, all right, but not great. Some of them raved and roared, which was better. And although she had been slapped upside the head, punched in the eye, spat on, and once kicked in the ass so hard she had gone sprawling in the gravel parking lot of the Red Windmill, she had never been raped. They had all gone home with the blue balls, every damn effing one of them, which meant, in Detta Walker's book, that she was the reigning champion, the undefeated queen of what? Of them? Of all those crew-cut, buttoned-down, tight-ass, honky motherfuckers. Until now. There was no way to withstand the demon who lived in the speaking ring, no door handles to grab, no car to tumble out of, no building to run back into, no cheek to slap, no face to claw, no balls to kick if the O-faced son of a bitch was slow getting the message. The demon was on her, and then in a flash, he was in her. She could feel it. Him pressing her backward even though she could not see it. Him. She could not see it. His hands, but could see their work as her dress tore violently open in several places. Then suddenly, pain. It felt as if she were being ripped open down there, and in her agony and surprise she screamed. Eddie looked around, his eyes narrowing. "I'm all right," she yelled. "Go on, Eddie. Forget about me. I'm all right." But she wasn't. For the first time since Detta had strode on to the sexual battlefield at the age of 13, she was losing. A horrid, engorged coldness plunged into her. It was like being fucked with an icicle. Dimly she saw Eddie turn away and begin drawing in the dirt, his expression of warm concern fading back into terrible concentrated coldness she sometimes felt in him and saw in his face. Well, that was all right, wasn't it? She had told him to go on, to forget her, to do what he needed to do in order to bring the boy over. This was her part of Jake's drawing, and she had no right to hate either of the men who had not twisted her arm or anything else to make her do it. But as the coldness froze her and Eddie turned away from her, she hated them both. Could, in fact, have torn their honky balls off. Ned Roland was with her. His strong hands were on his shoulders, and although he didn't speak, she heard him. "Don't fight. You can win if you can't win if you fight. You can only die. Sex is its weapon, Susanna, but it's also its weakness." Yes, it was always their weakness. The only difference was that this time, she was going to have to give a little more. But maybe that was all right. Maybe in the end she would be able to make this invisible honky demon pay a little more. She forced herself to relax her thighs. Immediately they spread apart, pushing long, curved fans into the dirt. She threw her head back into the rain, which was now pelting down, and sensed its face lolling just over hers, eager eyes drinking in every contorted grimace which passed over her face. She reached up with one hand as if to slap, and instead slid it around the nape of her demon rapist's neck. It was like cupping a palmful of solid smoke. And did she feel it twitch backward, surprised at her caress? She tilted her pelvis upward, using a grip on the invisible neck to create leverage. At the same time, she spread her legs even wider, splitting what remained of her dress back up the side stream. God, it was huge. "Come on," she panted. "You ain't gonna rape me. You ain't. You wanna fuck me? I'll fuck you. I'll give you a fucking you ain't never had. Fuck you to death." She felt the engorgement within her tremble, felt the demon try, at least momentarily, to draw back and regroup. Honey," she croaked. She squeezed her thighs inward, penning it. "The fun just startin'." She began to flex. Humping at the invisible presence, she reached up with her free hand, interlacing all 10 fingers, and allowed herself to fall backwards with her hips cocked, her straining arms seeming to hold nothing. She tossed her swept hair out of her eyes, her lips split in a shark-like grin. "Let me go!" a voice cried out in her mind, but at the same time she could feel the owner of the voice responding in spite of itself. "No way, sugar! You wanted it. Now you're gonna get it." She thrust, holding on to it, concentrating fiercely on the freezing cold inside of her. "I'm gonna melt that icicle, sugar, and when it's gone, what you gonna do then?" Her lips rose and fell, rose and fell. She squeezed her thighs mercilessly together, closed her eyes, clawed more deeply into the unseen neck, and prayed that Eddie would be quick. She didn't know how long she could do this. The problem, Jake thought, was simple. Somewhere in this dank, terrible place was a locked door. The right door. All he had to do was find it, but it was hard because he could feel the presence in the house gathering, the sound of those dissonant, gabbling voices, and was beginning to merge into the sound of a low, grating whisper. And it was approaching. A door stood open to the right. Beside it, thumbtacked to the wall, was a faded daguerreotype which showed a hanged man dangling like a piece of rotten fruit from a dead tree. Beyond it was a room that had once been a kitchen. The stove was gone, but an ancient icebox, the kind with the circular refrigerator drum on top, stood on the far side of the hilly, faded linoleum. Its door gaped open. Black, smelly stuff was caked inside and had trickled down to form a long congealed puddle on the floor. The kitchen cabinet stood open. In one he saw what was probably the world's oldest can of Snow's clam friettes. Poking out of another was the head of a dead rat. Its eyes were white and seemingly in motion, and after a moment Jake realized that the empty sockets were filled with squirming maggots. Something fell into his hair with a flabby thump. Jake screamed in surprise, reached for it, and grasped at something that felt like soft, bristle-covered rubber ball. He pulled it free and saw it was a spider, its bloated body the color of a fresh bruise. Its eyes regarded him with stupid malevolence. Jake threw it against the wall. It broke open and splattered there, legs twitching feebly. Another one dropped onto his neck. Jake felt a sudden painful bite just below the place where his hair stopped. He ran backward into the wall, tripped over the fallen banister, fell heavily, and felt the spider pop. Its innards, wet, feverish, and slippery, slid between his shoulder blades like warm egg yolks. Now he could see other spiders in the kitchen doorway. Some hung on almost invisible silken threads like obscene plump bobs. Others simply dropped on the floor in a series of muddy plops and scuttered eagerly over to greet him. Jake flailed to his feet, still screaming. He felt something in his mind, something that felt like a frayed rope starting to give way. He supposed it was his sanity, and at that realization Jake's considerable courage finally broke. He could bear this no longer, no matter what the stake. He bolted, meaning to flee if he still could, and realized too late that he had turned the wrong way and was running deeper into the mansion instead of back toward the porch. He lunged into a space too big to be a parlor or a living room. It seemed to be a ballroom. Elves with strange, sly smiles on their faces capered on the wallpaper, peering at Jake from beneath peaked green caps. A moldy couch was pushed against one wall. In the center of the warped wooden floor was a splintering chandelier, its rusty chain lying in snarls along the spilled glass beads and dusty teardrop pendants. Jake skirted the wreck. Snatching one terrified glance back over his shoulder, he saw no spiders. If not for the nastiness still trickling down his back, he might have believed he had imagined them. He looked forward again and came to a sudden skidding halt. Ahead, a pair of French doors stood half open on their recessed tracks. Another hallway stretched beyond. At the end of this second corridor stood a closed door with a golden knob. Written across the door, or perhaps carved into it, were two words: The Boy. Below the doorknob was a filigreed silver plate and a keyhole. I found it, Jake thought fiercely. I finally found it. That's it. That's the door. From behind him a low groaning noise began, as if the house was beginning to tear itself apart. Jake turned and looked back across the ballroom. The wall on the far side of the room had begun to swell outward, pushing the ancient couch ahead of it. And the old wallpaper shuddered. The elves began to ripple and dance and play. In the places the paper simply snapped upward in long curls, like window shades which have been released too suddenly. The plaster bulged forward in a pregnant curve. From beneath it, Jake could hear dry snapping sounds as the lathing broke, rearranging itself into some new, as yet hidden shape. And still the sound increased, only it was no longer precisely a groan. Now it was like a snarl. He stared, hypnotized, unable to pull his eyes away. The plaster didn't crack. didn't crack and then vomit outward in chunks. It seemed to have become plastic, and as the wall continued to bulge, making an irregular white bubble shape from which scraps and draggles of wallpaper still clung, the surface began to mold itself into hills and curves and valleys. Suddenly, Jake realized he was looking at a huge plastic face that was pushing itself out of the wall. It was looking at someone who has walked headfirst into a wet sheet. There was a loud snap as a chunk of broken lath tore free from the rippling wall. It became the jagged pupil of one eye. Below it, the wall writhed into a snarling mouth filled with jagged teeth. Jake could see fragments of wallpaper clinging to its lips and gums. One plaster hand tore free of the wall, trailing an unraveling bracelet of rotted electrical wire. It grasped the sofa and threw it aside, leaving ghostly white finger marks on its dark surface. More lathing burst free as the plaster fingers flexed. They created sharp, splintery claws. Now the face was all the way out of the wall and staring at Jake with its one wooden eye. Above it, in the center of its forehead, one wallpaper elf still danced. It looked like a weird tattoo. There was a wrenching sound as the thing began to slide forward. The hall doorway tore out and became a hunched shoulder. The thing's one free hand clawed across the door, spraying glass droplets from the fallen chandelier. Jake's paralysis broke. He turned, lunged through the French doors, and pelted down the length of hallway, with his pack bouncing and his right hand groping for the key in his pocket. His heart was a runaway factory machine in his chest. Behind him, the thing which was crawling out of the mansion's woodwork bellowed at him, and although there were no words, Jake knew what it was saying. It was telling him to stand still, telling him that it was useless to run, telling him there was no escape. The whole house now seemed alive, and the air resounded with splintering wood and squalling beams. The humming, insane voice of the doorkeeper was everywhere. Jake's hand closed on the key, and as he brought it out, one of the notches caught in his pocket. His fingers, wet with sweat, slipped. The key fell to the floor, bounced, dropped through a crack between two warped boards, and disappeared. "He's in trouble," Susanna heard Eddie shout, but the sound of his voice was distant. She had plenty of trouble herself, but she thought she might be doing okay just the same. "I'm going to melt that icicle, sugar," she had told the demon. "I'm going to melt it. And when it's gone, what you going to do then?" She hadn't melted it exactly, but she had changed it. The thing inside her was certainly giving her no pleasure, but at least the terrible pain had subsided and it was no longer cold. It was trapped, unable to disengage. Nor was she holding it in with her body exactly. Roland had said sex was its weakness as well as its weapon, and he had been right as usual. It had taken her, but she had also taken it, and now it was as if each of them had a finger stuck in one of those fiendish Chinese tubes where yanking only sticks you tighter. She hung on to one idea for dear life. Had to, because all other conscious thought had vanished. She had to hold this sobbing, frightened, vicious thing in the snare of its own helpless lust. It wriggled and thrust and convulsed, screamed to be let go, and at the same time it used her body with greedy, helpless intensity. But she would not let it go free. "And what's going to happen when I finally do let go?" she wondered desperately. "What's it going to do to pay me back?" She didn't know. The rain was falling in sheets, threatening to turn the circle within the stones into a sea of mud. "Hold something over the door," Eddie shouted. "Don't let the rain wash it out." Roland snatched a glance at Susanna and saw she was still struggling with the demon. Her eyes were half shut, her mouth pulled down in a harsh grimace. He could not see or hear the demon, but he could sense its angry, frightened thrashings. Eddie turned his streaming face toward him. "Did you hear me?" he shouted. "Get something over the goddamn door, and do it now." Roland yanked one of their hides from his pack and held a corner in each hand. Then he stretched his arms out and leaned over Eddie, creating a makeshift tent. The tip of Eddie's homemade pencil was caked with mud. He wiped it across his arm, leaving a smear the color of bitter chocolate, and wrapped his fist around the stick again, then bent over his drawing. It was not exactly the same size as the door on Jake's side of the barrier. The ratio was perhaps 0.75 to 1, but it would be big enough for Jake to come through. if the keys worked. If he even has a key, isn't that what you mean? He asked himself. Suppose he dropped it, or that house made him drop it. He drew a plate under the circle which represented the doorknob, hesitated, and then squiggled the familiar shape of the keyhole within it. He hesitated. There was one more thing, but what? It was hard to think of because it felt as if there were a tornado roaring through his head, a tornado with random thoughts flipping around inside instead of uprooted barns and privies and chicken houses. Come on, sugar, Susanna cried from behind him. You weakening on me? What's the matter? I thought you was some kind of holy shit stud boy. Boy, that was it. Carefully he wrote, the boy, across the top panel of the door with the tip of his stick. At the instant he finished the Y, the drawing changed. The circle of rain-darkened earth had drawn suddenly, darkened even more, and pushed up from the ground, becoming a dark, gleaming knob. And instead of brown, wet earth with the shape of the keyhole, he could see a dim light. Behind him, Susanna shrieked at the demon again, urging it on, but now she sounded as if she were tiring. This had to end, and soon. Eddie bent forward from the waist, like a Muslim saluting Allah, and put his eye to the keyhole he had drawn. He looked through it into his own world, into that house which he and Henry had gone to see in May of 1977. Unaware, except he, Eddie, had not been unaware, no, not totally unaware even then, that a boy from another part of the city was following them. He saw a hallway. Jake was down on his hands and knees, tugging frantically at a board. Something was coming for him. Eddie could see it, but at the same time, he could not. It was as if part of his brain refused to see it, as if seeing would lead to comprehension and comprehension to madness. Hurry up, Jake, he screamed into the keyhole. For Christ's sake, move it! Above the speaking ring, thunder ripped the sky like cannon fire, and rain turned to hail. For a moment after the key fell, Jake only stood where he was, staring down at the narrow crack between the boards. Incredibly, he felt sleepy. That shouldn't have happened, he thought. It's one thing too much. I can't go on with this, not 1 minute, not one single second longer. I'm going to curl up against this door instead. I'm going to go to sleep right away, all at once, and when it grabs me and pulls me toward its mouth, I'll never wake up. Then the thing coming out of the wall grunted, and when Jake looked up, his urge to give in vanished in a single stroke of terror. Now it was all the way out of the wall. A giant plaster head with one broken wooden eye and one reaching plaster hand. Chunks of lathing stood out on its skull and random hackles like a child's drawing of hair. It saw Jake and opened its mouth, revealing jagged wooden teeth, and it grunted again. Plaster dust drifted out of its yawning mouth like cigar smoke. Jake fell to his knees and peered into the crack. The key was a small, brave shimmer of silvery light down there in the dark, but the crack was far too narrow to admit his fingers. He seized one of the boards, yanked with all his might. The nails which held it groaned, but held. There was a jangling crash. He looked down the hallway and saw the hand which was bigger than his whole body seize the fallen chandelier and throw it aside. The rusty chain, which had once held it suspended, rose like a bullwhip and then came down with a heavy crump. A dead lamp on a rusty chain rattled above Jake, dirty glass shattering against the ancient brass. The doorkeeper's head, attached only to its single hunched shoulder and reaching arm, slid forward above the floor. Behind it, the remains of the wall collapsed in a cloud of dust. A moment later, the fragments humped up and became the creature's twisted, bony back. The doorkeeper saw Jake looking and seemed to grin. As it did, splinters of wood poked out of its wrinkling cheeks. It dragged itself forward through the dust-hazed ballroom, mouth opening and closing, its great hand groping amid the ruins, feeling for purchase, and ripped one of the French doors at the end of the hall from its track. Jake screamed breathlessly and began to wrench at the board again. It wouldn't come, but the gunslinger's voice did. The other one, Jake. Try the other one. He let go of the board he had been yanking at and grabbed the one on the other side. As he did, another voice spoke. He heard this one not in his head but with his ears and understood it was coming from the other side of the door. The door he had been looking for ever since the day he had been run over in the street. "Hurry up, Jake." Or hadn't been run over in the street. "Hurry up, Jake, for Christ's sake, hurry up." When he yanked this other board it came free so easily that he almost tumbled over backward. Two women were standing in the doorway of the used appliance shop across the street from the mansion. The older was the proprietor. The younger had been her only customer when the sound of the crashing walls and breaking beams began. Now, without knowing what they were doing it, they linked arms about each other's waists and stood that way, trembling like children who hear a noise in the dark. Up the street a trio of boys on the way back to Dutch Hill Little League field stood gaping at the house, their red ball flyer wagon filled with baseball equipment forgotten behind them. A delivery driver nosed his van into the curb and got out to look. The patrons of Henry's Corner Market and Dutch Hill Pub came straggling up the street, looking around wildly. Now the ground began to tremble and a fan of fine cracks started to spread across Reinhold Street. "Is it an earthquake?" the delivery van driver shouted at the women standing outside of the appliance shop. But instead of waiting for an answer, he jumped back behind the wheel of his van and drove away rapidly, swerving to the wrong side of the street to keep away from the ruined house, which was the epicenter of the convulsions. The entire house seemed to be bowing inward. Boards splintered, jumping off its face, and rained down into the yard. Dirty gray-black waterfalls of slate shingles poured down the eaves. There was an ear-splitting bang and a long, zigzagging crack shot down the center of the mansion. The door disappeared into it, and then the whole house began to swallow itself from the outside in. The younger woman suddenly broke the older one's grip. "I'm getting out of here," she said, and she began to run up the street without looking back. A hot, strange wind began to sigh down the hallway, blowing Jake's sweaty hair back from his brow as his fingers closed over the silver key. He now understood on some instinctive level what his place was and what was happening. The doorkeeper was not just in the house. It was the house, every board, every shingle, every window sill, every eave, and now it was pushing forward, becoming some crazily jumbled representation of its true shape as it did. It meant to catch him before he could use the key. Beyond the giant white head and the crooked, hulking shoulder, he could see boards and shingles and wire and bits of glass. Even the front door and the broken banister flying up the main hall and into the ballroom, joining the form which bulked there, creating more and more of the misshapen plaster man that was even now groping toward him with its freakish hand. Jake yanked his own hand out of the hole in the floor and saw it was covered with huge, trundling beetles. He slapped it against the wall to knock them off and cried out as the wall first opened and then tried to close around his wrist. He yanked his hand free just in time, whirled, and jammed the silver key into the hole in the plate. The plaster man roared again, but its voice was momentarily drowned out by the harmonic shout which Jake recognized. He had heard it in the vacant lot, but it had been very quiet then, perhaps dreaming. Now it was an unequivocal cry of triumph. That sense of certainty, overwhelming, inarguable, filled him again, and this time he felt sure there would be no disappointment. He heard all the affirmations he needed in that voice. It was the voice of the rose. The dim light in the hallway was blotted out as the plaster hand tore away the other French door and squeezed into the corridor. The vase socked itself into the opening above the hand peering at Jake. The plaster fingers crawled toward him like the legs of a huge spider. Jake turned the key and felt a sudden surge of power rush up his arms. He heard a heavy muffled thump as the locked bolt inside withdrew. He seized the knob, turned it, and yanked the door open. It swung wide. Jake cried out in confused horror as he saw what lay behind. The doorway was blocked with earth, from top to bottom and side to side. Roots poked out like bunches of wire, worms, seeming as confused as Jake was himself, crawled hither and thither on the door-shaped pack of dirt. Some dived back into it, others went on crawling about as if wondering where the earth which had been below them a moment ago had gone. One dropped onto Jake's sneaker. The keyhole shape remained for a moment, shedding a spot of misty white light on Jake's shirt. Beyond it, So close, so out of reach, he could hear the rain and a muffled boom of thunder across an open sky. Then the keyhole shape was also blotted out, and a gigantic plaster fingers curled around Jake's lower leg. Eddie did not feel the sting of the hail as Roland dropped the hide, got to his feet, and ran to where Susanna lay. The gunslinger grabbed her beneath her arms and dragged her as gently and carefully as he could across to where Eddie crouched. "Let it go when I tell you, Susanna," Roland shouted. "Do you understand? When I tell you." Eddie saw and heard none of this. He heard only Jake screaming faintly on the other side of the door. The time had come to use the key. He pulled it out of his shirt and slid it into the keyhole he had drawn. He tried to turn it. The key would not turn. Not so much as a millimeter. Eddie lifted his face to the pelting hail, oblivious to the ice balls which struck his forehead and cheeks and lips, leaving welts and red blotches. "No!" he howled. "Oh, God, please, no!" But there was no answer from God. Only another crash of thunder and a streak of lightning across a sky now filled with racing clouds. Jake lunged upward, grabbed the chain of the lamp which hung above him, and ripped free the doorkeeper's clutching fingers. He swung backwards, used the packed earth in the doorway to push off, and then swung forward like a Tarzan on a vine. He raised his legs and kicked out at the clutching fingers as they closed on him, plaster exploding in chunks, revealing crudely jointed skeleton of lathing beneath. The plaster man roared, a sound of intermingled hunger and rage. Beneath that cry, Jake could hear the whole house collapsing, like the one in the story of Edgar Allan Poe. He pendulumed back on the chain, struck the wall of packed earth which blocked the doorway, and then swung forward again. The hand reached up for him, and he kicked it, wildly, legs scissoring. He felt a stab of pain in his foot as those wooden fingers clutched. When he swung back again, he was minus a sneaker. He tried for a higher grip on the chain, found it, and began to shimmy up toward the ceiling. There was a muffled creaking thud above him. Fine plaster dust had begun to sift down on his upturned, sweating face. The ceiling had begun to sag. The lamp chain was pulling out of it a link at a time. There was a thick crunching sound from the end of the hallway as the plaster man finally pushed its hungry face through the opening. Jake swung helplessly back toward that face, screaming. Eddie's terror and panic suddenly fell away. The cloak of coldness dropped over him. A cloak Roland of Gilead had worn many times. It was the only armor the true gunslinger possessed, and all such a one needed. At the same moment a voice spoke in his mind. He had been haunted by such voices over the last 3 months. His mother's voice, Roland's voice, and, of course, Henry's. But this one he recognized with relief was his own, and it was at last calm and rational and courageous. "You saw the shape of the key in the fire. You saw it again in the wood, and both times you saw it perfectly. Later on you put on a blindfold of fear over your eyes. Take it off, and look again. It may not be too late even now." He was faintly aware that the gunslinger was staring at him grimly, faintly aware that Susanna was shrieking at the demon in a fading but still defiant voice, faintly aware that on the other side of the door Jake was screaming in terror, or was it now agony? Eddie ignored them all. He pulled the wooden key out of the keyhole he had drawn, out of the door which was now real, and looked at it fixedly, trying to recapture the innocent delight he had sometimes known as a child, the delight of seeing a coherent shape hidden in senselessness, and there it was, the place he'd gone wrong. So clearly visible he couldn't understand how he'd missed it in the first place. I really must have been wearing a blindfold, he thought. It was the S shape at the end of the key, of course. The second curve was a bit too fat, just a tiny bit. "Knife," he said, and held it out over his hand like a surgeon in an operating room, and Roland slapped it into his palm without a word. Eddie gripped on the top of the blade between the thumb and the first finger of his right hand. He bent over the key, unmindful of the hail which pelted his protruding neck, and the shape in the wood stood out more clearly. Stood out, its own lovely and undeniable reality. He scraped it once delicately, a single sliver of ash so thin it was almost transparent, curled up from the belly of the S shape at the end of the key. On the other side of the door, Jake Chambers shrieked again. The chain let go with a rattling crash, and Jake fell heavily, landing on his knees. The doorkeeper roared in triumph. The plaster hand seized Jake around his hips and began to drag him down the hall. He stuck his leg out in front of him, planted his feet, but it did no good. He felt splinters and rust-blunted nails digging into skin as his hand tightened its grip and continued to drag him forward. The face appeared to be stuck just inside the entrance to the hallway like a cork in a bottle. The pressure it had exerted to get in that far had squeezed the rudimentary features into a new shape. That of some monstrous malformed troll. The mouth yawned open to receive him. Jake groped madly for the key, wanting to use it as some last-ditch talisman, but of course he had left it in the door. "You son of a bitch!" he screamed, and threw himself backwards with all his strength, bowing with his back like an Olympic diver, unmindful of the broken boards which dug into him like a belt of nails. He felt his jeans slide down on his hips, and the grip of the hand slipped momentarily. Jake lunged again. The hand clenched brutally, but Jake's jeans slid down to his knees, and as his back slammed to the door with the pack-to-cushion blow, the hand loosened, perhaps wanting to secure a firmer grip upon its prey. Jake was able to draw his knees up a little, and when the hand tightened again, Jake drove his legs forward. The hand yanked backward at the same time, and what Jake hoped for happened. His jeans and his remaining sneaker were peeled from his body, leaving him free again, at least for a moment. He saw the hand rotate on his wrist of boards and disintegrating plaster, and jam his dungarees into his mouth. Then he was crawling back toward the blocked doorway on his hands and knees, oblivious of the glass fragments from the fallen lamp, wanting only to get his key again. He had almost reached the door when the hand closed over his naked legs and began to pull him back once more. The shape was there now, finally all there. Eddie put the key back into the keyhole and applied pressure. For a moment there was resistance, and then it revolved beneath his hand. He heard the locking mechanism turn, heard the bar pull back, felt the key crack in two the moment it had served its purpose. He grasped the dark, polished knob with both hands and pulled. There was a sense of great weight wheeling on an unseen pivot, a feeling that his arm had been gifted with boundless strength, and a clear knowledge that the two worlds had suddenly come in contact. And a way had been opened between them. He felt a moment of dizziness and disorientation, and as he looked through the doorway he realized why. Although he was looking down, vertically, he was seeing horizontally. It was like a strange optical illusion created with prisms and mirrors. And then he saw Jake being pulled backward, down the glass and plaster-littered hallway, elbows dragging, calves pinned together by a giant hand. And he saw the monstrous mouth which had awaited him, fuming some white fog that might have been either smoke or dust. "Roland!" Eddie shouted. "Roland, it's got him!" Then he was knocked aside. Susanna was aware of being hauled up and whirled around. The world was a carousel blur. Standing stones, gray sky, hailstone-littered ground, and a rectangle hole that looked like a trapdoor in the ground. Screams drifted up from it. Within her the demon raved and struggled, wanting only to escape, but helpless now to do so until she allowed it. "Now!" Roland shouted. "Let it go. Now, Susanna. For your father's sake, let it go now." And she did. She had, with Detta's help, constructed a trap for it in her mind, something like a net of woven rushes, and now she cut them. She felt the demon fly back from her at once, and there was an instant of terrible hollowness, terrible emptiness. These feelings were at once overshadowed by relief and a grim sense of nastiness and defilement. As its invisible weight fell away, she glimpsed it, an inhuman shape like a manta ray with huge curling wings and something that looked like a cruel, bailing hook curving out and up from beneath. She saw and sensed the thing flash above the open hole in the ground. Saw Eddie looking up with wide eyes, saw Roland spread his arms wide to catch the demon. The gunslinger staggered back, almost knocked off his feet by the unseen weight of the demon. Then he rocked forward again, and with an armload of nothing, clutching it, he jumped through the doorway and was gone. Sudden white light flooded the hallway of the mansion. Hailstones struck the walls and bounced up from broken boards of the floor. Jake heard confused shouts. Then he saw the gunslinger come through. He seemed to leap through, as if he had come from above. His arms were held far out in front of him, and the tips of his fingers were locked. Jake felt his feet slide into the doorkeeper's mouth. "Roland!" he shrieked. "Roland, help me!" The gunslinger's hands parted and his arms were immediately thrown wide. He staggered backward, and Jake felt serrated teeth touch his skin, ready to tear flesh and grind bone, and then something huge rushed over his head like a gust of wind. A moment later the teeth were gone. The hand which had pinned his legs together relaxed. He heard an unearthly shriek of pain and surprise begin to issue from the doorkeeper's dusty throat, and then it was muffled, crammed back. Roland grabbed Jake and hauled him to his feet. "You came!" Jake shouted. "You really came!" "I came, yes. By the grace of the gods and the courage of my friends, I came." As the doorkeeper roared again, Jake burst into tears of relief and terror. Now the house sounded like a ship foundering in a heavy sea. Chunks of wood and plaster fell all around them. Roland swept Jake into his arms and ran for the door. The plaster hand, groping wildly, stuck one of his booted feet and spun him into a wall which again tried to bite. Roland pushed forward, turned, and drew his gun. He fired twice into the aimlessly thrashing hand, vaporizing one of the crude plaster fingers. Behind them, the face of the doorkeeper had gone from white to a dingy purplish black, as if it were choking on something which had been fleeing so rapidly that it had entered the monster's mouth and jammed in its gullet before it realized what it was doing. Roland turned again and ran through the doorway. Although there was now no visible barrier, he was stopped cold for a moment, as if an unseen meshwork had been drawn across the chair. Then he felt Eddie's hands in his hair, and he was yanked not upward, but forward. They emerged into wet air and slackening hail like babies being born. Eddie was the midwife, as the gunslinger told him he must be. He was sprawled forward on his chest and belly, his arms out of sight in the doorway, his hands clutching fistfuls of Roland's hair. "Suze, help me!" She wriggled forward, reached through, and groped a hand under Roland's chin. He came up to her with his head cocked backward and his lips parted in a snarl of pain and effort. Eddie felt a tearing sensation, and one of his hands came free, holding thick locks of the gunslinger's gray-streaked hair. "He's slipping." "This motherfucker ain't nowhere," Susanna gasped and gave a terrific wrench, as if she meant to snap Roland's neck. Two small hands shot out of the doorway in the center of the circle and clutched one of the edges. Freed of Jake's weight, Roland got an elbow up, and a moment later he was boosting himself out. As he did it, Eddie grabbed Jake's wrist and hauled him up. Jake rolled onto his back and lay there, panting. Eddie turned to Susanna, took her in his arms, and began to rain kisses on her forehead, her cheeks, her neck. He was laughing and crying at the same time. She clung to him, breathing hard, but there was a small, satisfied smile on her lips, and one hand slipped over Eddie's wet hair in a slow, contented stroke. From below them came a cauldron of black sounds, squeals, grunts, thuds, crashes. Roland crawled away from the hole with his head down. His hair stood up in a wild wad. Threads of blood trickled down his cheeks. "Shut it," he gasped at Eddie. "Shut it for your father's sake." Eddie got the door moving, and those vast unseen hinges did the rest. The door fell with a gigantic, toneless bang, cutting off all sound from below. As Eddie watched, the lines that he had marked, its edges faded back to smudges marked in the dirt. The doorknob lost its dimensions, and once more only the circle he'd drawn with the stick. Where the keyhole had been, there was only a crude shape with a chunk of wood sticking out of it, like the hilt of a sword from a stone. Susanna went to Jake and pulled him gently to a sitting position. "You all right, sugar?" He looked at her dazedly. "Yes, I think so. Where is he? The gunslinger. There's something I have to ask him." "I'm here, Jake," Roland said. He got to his feet, Drunk walked over to Jake and hunkered beside him. He touched the boy's smooth cheek almost unbelievably. "You won't let me drop this time?" "No," Roland said. "Not this time, not ever again." But in the deepest, darkest of his heart, he thought of the tower and wondered. The hail changed to a hard, driving rain, but Eddie could see glimpses of blue sky behind the unraveling clouds in the north. The storm was going to end soon, but in the meantime they were going to get drenched. He found he didn't mind. He could not remember when he had felt so calm, so at peace with himself, so utterly drained. This mad adventure wasn't over yet. He suspected, in fact, that it had barely begun, but today they had won a big one. Suze, he pushed her hair away from her face and looked into her dark eyes. Are you okay? Did it hurt you? Hurt me a little, but I'm okay. I think that bitch Detta Walker is still the undefeated Roadhouse champion, demon or no demon. What's that mean? She grinned impishly. Not much. Not anymore. Thank God. How about you, Eddie? All right? Eddie listened for Henry's voice and didn't hear it. He had an idea that Henry's voice might be gone for good. Even better than that, he said, and laughing, folded her into his arms again. Over her shoulder he could see what was left of the door, only a few faint lines and angles. Soon the rain would wash those away too. What's your name? Jake asked the woman whose legs stopped just above the knee. He was suddenly aware that he had lost his parents in his struggles to escape the doorkeeper or his pants in his struggles to escape the doorkeeper, and he pulled the tail of his shirt down over his underwear. There wasn't very much left of her dress, either, as far as that went. Susanna Dean, she said. I already know your name. Susanna, Jake said thoughtfully. I don't suppose your father owns a railroad company, does he? She looked astonished for a moment, then threw her head back and laughed. Why, no, sugar. He was a dentist who went and invented a few things and got rich. What makes you ask a thing like that? Jake didn't answer. He had turned his attention to Eddie. The terror had already left his face, and his eyes had regained that cool, assessing look which Roland remembered so well from the way station. Hi, Jake, Eddie said. Good to see you, man. Hi, Jake said. I met you earlier today, but you were a lot younger then. I was a lot younger 10 minutes ago. Are you okay? Yes, Jake said. Some scratches, that's all. He looked around. You haven't found the train yet? This was not a question. Eddie and Susanna exchanged puzzled looks, but Roland only shook his head. No train. Are your voices gone? Roland nodded. All gone. Yours? Gone. I'm all together again. We both are. They looked at the same instant with the same impulse. As Roland swept Jake into his arms and the boy's unnatural self-possession broke and he began to cry, it was the exhausted, relieved weeping of the child who has lost long, suffered much, and is finally safe again. As Roland's arms closed around his waist, Jake's own arms slipped around the gunslinger's neck and gripped like hoops of steel. I'll never leave you again, Roland said, and now his own tears came. I swear it to you on the names of all my fathers, I'll never leave you again. Yet his heart, that silent, watchful, lifelong prisoner of Ka, received the words of this promise not just with wonder, but with doubt. And we will stop there because that will put us on book 2 of book 3. So next time we will start on book 2, Lud, and the first part of that book is called A Heap of Broken Images. That is where we will start next time. Sorry that this had to be done in 2 parts and was still interrupted. I did not love that aspect for us, but that's okay. It's okay. At least we're getting back on it, right? I think after this one, I might read us another story with not a happy ending. Not after this book, after this series, of course. And it's a long, long while away. But I have 2 ideas of where to go, and I don't know which way I want to go. One will take a lot of people, like 9 people, to pull off. So if I can't get like 8 or 9 people to do that one with me, then we'll probably go with The Long Walk. And if you haven't read The Long Walk, I'm sorry. It'll be much, much shorter. It is a shorter novel, so not like the series we're reading now. If you are interested in voicing your opinion on which direction we should go, then let me know and I'll do a poll. I'll let you guys know. I'll let you vote. I'll let you do whatever you want. Yeah. So if If you come to my streams, great. I'll see you on my streams. And if not, then I will see you on the next book club stream. Thanks so much, pretty shiny peoples. Later days. Do not forget to smile and have some fun, okay? Bye.